In the third week of November, 1973, in the basement of the London Metropolitan Archive on Northampton Road, a conservator named Gerald Ashby pulled a mislabeled folder from a fire-damaged cabinet. Outside, rain moved in dense curtains across Clerkenwell. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone and old iron. The folder was labeled in faded pencil, miscellaneous. Streetworks, Islington, 1863 to 1871. It should have contained routine correspondence about gas mains and pavement resurfacing. What Ashby found instead were 11 sheets of engineering drawings, each one nearly 3 feet wide when unrolled. They showed, in precise ink lines, something that appeared nowhere in any official planning record he had encountered. A continuous concrete platform running beneath 14 consecutive terrace houses on Barnsbury Street, undivided by property lines, sinking to a uniform depth of just over 20 feet below the pavement level. In the margin of the third sheet, in a different hand in a darker ink, someone had written 3 words and then crossed them out. Yes, the crossing out was thorough. Only the word permanent remained legible. Ashby set the folder aside. He did not report it. He filed it under the same miscellaneous label and placed it back in the cabinet. He would return to it. He did not know, in that moment, that the answer he was looking for was not in the folder at all, but beneath the pavement outside. The story of the Victorian terrace house is usually told as a story of facades. The symmetrical windows, the shared party walls, the identical front doors stepping in confident rows down streets that were themselves engineered to Prazel gradients. Guidebooks describe these houses as triumphs of speculative building, cheap, fast, uniform, and profitable. The history that appears in planning archives focuses on what could be seen: the ironwork railings, the painted stucco, the tiled steps. What lies beneath is described, when it is described at all, in the briefest of terms: rubble fill, strip foundations, shallow footings. Yes, the standard language of Victorian construction. The measurements, however, tell a different story. On the 7th of March, 1862, a civil engineer named Thomas Colquhoun filed a structural report with the vestry of St. Mary, Islington, a document that can still be found, partly, in the London Metropolitan Archive. The report is 17 pages long. Pages 3 through 9 are missing. They were not damaged by fire. The catalog record notes their absence without explanation. What remains describes a survey of ground conditions along the intended route of Barnsbury Street, commissioned in advance of a major terrace development by the builder George Myers. Colquhoun's surviving prose is measured and technical. He writes of clay substrates, of groundwater infiltration, of the particular instability created when dense London clay is intersected by buried stream channels. He recommends foundations sunk to a depth sufficient to pass entirely through the affected stratum. He does not specify that depth in the surviving pages. The specification would have appeared on page 4. Page 4 is among the missing. A survey conducted in October 2017 by structural engineers assessing subsidence risk along a section of Lonsdale Square in Islington used ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface profile of a row of mid-Victorian terrace houses. The survey report, published as a technical appendix to a planning application and largely unread outside specialist circles, it noted with some surprise that the individual strip foundations of the 11 houses surveyed appeared to merge, at a depth of approximately 6 meters, into a single continuous reinforced platform. The word reinforced prompted further investigation. Portland cement concrete with any form of internal reinforcement was not in common use in Britain in 1862. The survey team requested access to a cellar. The access was granted. The camera that descended into the excavated test pit found, at a depth consistent with the radar profile, a poured concrete structure of uniform mix and remarkable density. There was no rubble, no underpinned brick, no individual footings. One continuous, an unbroken slab. The official record of that survey notes the finding and then proceeds, without further comment, to its recommendations regarding the immediate subsidence risk. No follow-up investigation was commissioned. The planning application was approved. Yes, the terrace houses above were underpinned using conventional modern methods that attached to the existing structure at cellar floor level, connecting to a foundation whose true depth and character the planning record does not acknowledge. This is how the history of the Victorian terrace disappears. Not through dramatic suppression, not through sealed archives or destroyed documents, yet through a bureaucratic quietness that is, in its own way, more complete. To understand what lies beneath Barnsbury Street, it is necessary to understand what was happening above London in the decade between 1855 and 1865. The city was growing at a rate that its governance structures were entirely unprepared to manage. As the population of inner North London increased by roughly 40% in that single decade, the pressure for housing was not theoretical. It was immediate, physical, expressed in overcrowding that health inspectors described in terms of cubic feet of breathable air per sleeping body. Speculative builders like George Myers were not philanthropists. Yes, they were businessmen responding to a market, but the speed of construction imposed its own discipline. A terrace of 14 houses could not be built one at a time. It had to be conceived as a single unit, built as a single unit, and, crucially, founded as a single unit. On the 12th of April, 1863, the parish vestry records for St. Mary Islington include a payment authorization for excavation works on Barnsbury Street. The sum is listed. The purpose is described as preliminary ground preparation. The quantity of material removed, measured in cubic yards and also listed, is substantially larger than would be required for individual strip foundations. A modern structural engineer, as reading those cubic yard figures against the street's known dimensions, would calculate that the excavation ran not to the 3 or 4 feet typical of shallow Victorian strip foundations, but to something considerably deeper. The arithmetic is not complicated. The excavation volume, divided by the street frontage, yields a depth of between 18 and 22 feet across the full width of the planned terrace. Not below individual houses, below all of them, simultaneously. The winter of 1863 to 1864 was unusually dry. The clay beneath Barnsbury Street, which Colquhoun had identified as unstable where it met buried water channels, would have been at its most workable. The pace of the dig, recorded in labor accounts submitted to Myers's office and preserved in a family archive donated to the Guildhall Library in 1961, shows a team of 32 navvies working in shifts 6 days a week for 11 weeks, 32 men. 11 weeks, 6 days, for foundations that the official record describes as conventional. The labor accounts stop in late January. Now, the next document in Myers's archive is a purchase order dated the 4th of February, 1864, for quantities of Portland cement and sharp sand. The quantities are given in tons. They are large. The notation beside the order in Myers's own hand reads, "For the plate, not foundations, not footings, not groundwork. The plate." The word does not appear again in any surviving document associated with the Barnsbury Street development. When the terrace houses were advertised for sale later that year, in notices placed in the Builder and the Illustrated London News, they were described as solidly constructed on good foundations. The language was standard. It conveyed nothing. When Gerald Ashby returned to the folder in the Metropolitan Archive in December 1973, he brought with him a magnifying glass and a colleague, a building historian named Patricia Morehouse, who had spent the previous decade researching the construction methods of Victorian speculative builders. Together, they unrolled the engineering drawings again under better light. Yet the continuous concrete platform was unmistakable. But what drew Morehouse's attention was a detail near the edge of the third drawing, a cross-sectional profile showing the relationship between the platform and the clay beneath it. At the base of the platform, projecting downward at regular intervals, were what appeared to be cast iron piles, not deep enough to reach bedrock, but deep enough to anchor the plate against lateral movement, against the slow, seasonal shifting of London clay as it absorbed and released water across the annual cycle. This was not a foundation in the conventional sense. It was an isolation platform, something designed not merely to support the weight of the houses above, but to decouple them from the movement of the ground itself. Morehouse published a short paper about the drawings in 1976 in the Transactions of the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society. It received 3 citations in the following decade, none of them in engineering literature. The drawings remained in the archive. By the 14th of September, 1888, something was happening to Victorian terraces across North London that the engineering press was beginning to find difficult to explain. Houses that had stood for 2 decades without incident were showing uniform settlement, not individual subsidence, not the irregular cracking associated with differential movement between adjacent structures, but something more like a gentle, yet even lowering of the entire terrace block, consistent across multiple properties simultaneously. A letter published in The Engineer on that date described observations in Highbury and in parts of Kentish Town, where rows of 20 or more houses had moved in perfect concert, the party walls between them showing no cracking at all. Yet the uniform settlement visible only in the slight displacement of the ground floor thresholds relative to the pavement. The letter writer, who signed only as CBE, noted that this kind of coordinated movement implied a common structural element below the property line, something connecting adjacent houses in the substrate in a way that individual ownership of the surface would not suggest. As the letter drew no published response, the journal moved him on to other matters. The engineering logic, once examined, is straightforward enough to describe. London clay is a material that expands when wet and contracts when dry. Its seasonal movement is measurable, in some locations several centimeters annually. A house built on conventional strip foundations, each responding independently to the clay beneath it, will move slightly differently from its neighbor, because the clay conditions beneath each foundation differ slightly. The distance from a buried stream, the depth of the water table, the shade cast by the building itself. Over decades, these small differences accumulate. Party walls crack, cornices separate, door frames rack out of square. A house built on a continuous shared platform does not do these things. It moves as one. The platform distributes load across the full length of the terrace, smoothing out the local variations in clay behavior. A settlement that might, beneath an individual house, appear as a cracked lintel appears instead as a measurement no one thinks to take. The slow, uniform descent of an entire block, so gradual and so even that it registers only over years and only to someone looking for it. This is why Victorian terraces look, from the outside, so intact. Not because they were built to exceptional individual standards, but because they were built collectively on a foundation that made their individuality, at the level of the street surface, possible. On the 3rd of June 2003, a property developer converting a row of 6 Victorian terrace houses in Stoke Newington into residential apartments commissioned a structural survey prior to removing internal walls. Men of the surveyor's report noted that the cellar floors of all 6 properties sat on what appeared to be a single poured concrete surface, continuing without interruption beneath the party walls. The surveyor recommended further investigation. The developer's response asked whether the shared cellar floor created any legal complication with respect to the individual leasehold boundaries. Whilst the solicitor's response concluded that it did not, since the relevant boundary instruments described above-ground structures and made no reference to subsurface conditions. The survey recommendation was not followed up. The walls were removed. The apartments were sold. Each one sits now, is so on a foundation that its individual title does not describe, and its residents do not know exists. There is, somewhere beneath the streets of Islington and Hackney and Kentish Town, a continuous underground architecture that has no entry in any property register, no owner of record, no maintenance schedule, and no formal acknowledgement of its own existence. It was built in the 1860s and 1870s by men who understood very well what they were doing, and who chose, for reasons that the remaining documents do not explain, to describe it as something simpler. The plate became groundwork. The platform became footings. The shared foundation became, in the language of the record, a series of individual structures that happened to sit in proximity. This renaming was not accidental. In a city governed by the doctrine of individual freehold property, a continuous subsurface structure that crossed 17 legal boundaries was a conceptual problem that the law of the time had no easy mechanism to address. It was simpler, and perhaps necessary, to build it and then describe it in terms the law could accommodate. Today, it's the engineering principle that Myers's builders applied in 1863 appears in modern structural practice under different names: raft foundations, mat foundations, combined footings. The terminology is precise and well documented. The method is considered standard for sites with variable or unstable soils. Modern engineering guides describe its advantages in language that Cole Cahoon, had he read them, would likely have recognized: the distribution of load across a continuous horizontal element, the isolation of the supported structure from differential ground movement, the prevention of cracking at the joints between adjacent units. These are the same problems. These are the same solutions. What modern practice does not generally mention is that in the terraces of Victorian North London, the problem was solved collectively, not by individual builders making individual decisions about individual houses, but by a single engineering intelligence working across a street frontage that would later be divided into dozens of separate legal identities. The foundation came first. Yes, the property boundaries came after. The ground does not know about the property boundaries. The clay does not observe the division between number 41 and number 43. Below a depth of 20 feet, there is no 41 and 43. There is only the plate. When Ashby died in 1991, his personal papers went to a niece in Bristol. The niece, clearing the house, found among them a notebook in which Ashby had sketched, over the course of several years, a rough map of North London with locations marked in red ink. Each mark corresponded to a site where, through one route or another, he had found evidence of a continuous shared subsurface structure beneath a Victorian terrace. And there were 37 marks. He had written, at the bottom of the page, a single sentence. The houses do not know they share a floor. The niece kept the notebook. She did not know what to do with it. It sits now in a box in a cupboard in a house in Bristol, above its own foundation, which is, like all foundations, unknown to the rooms above it. Yet the rain that falls on Barnsbury Street today drains into a surface water system built in the 1970s. It does not reach the plate. The plate, if it is still what the 1973 drawings suggest it is, sits in the dark at 20 feet, holding 14 houses in quiet equilibrium. The houses above have changed hands dozens of times each. They have been renovated, extended, it's converted, and sold again. Their owners have fixed their ceilings and refinished their floors and measured their garden walls. No planning application for any of them has ever described what lies at the base of the excavation. The building control records refer to conventional foundations. The party wall awards between neighbors negotiate the surface. Below the surface, nothing is negotiated. Below the surface, the question of where one house ends and another begins has never been asked, because it has never needed to be answered. The silence in the archive on that question is not a gap. It is an answer in its own language. Some things are built to last, and built to be forgotten, and built to hold, whether or not anyone above them knows they are being held.